So I am Matthew Walker, and I'm a visiting professor in architectural history here in the Architecture School. I have a degree in history, not architecture, and that's from the University of Oxford. I then I did my doctorate at the University of York in a history of art department. I've kind of moved around quite a lot in my career. So that was in a history of art department, and my doctorate concerned the relationship between science and architecture at the end of the 17th century, in Britain predominantly. I then taught for a short period of time in Edinburgh before returning to Oxford as a postdoctoral research fellow, and then I taught at Oxford before moving here. It's been great. It's been really fantastic. I really enjoy being in an architecture school. I really love the building. I love walking around the building and seeing the studios, seeing the students at work. I think historians often end up sort of locked in our offices reading books and a little bit detached from the design world. But here I haven't felt that at all. I felt like I've been able to be involved in studio work, walk around the studios, and that's been really terrific. It's been really, really interesting for me. I've also really enjoyed teaching history here. One of the reasons I wanted to come here is because this state, more than any other state in America, has major architecture from the period I work on, from the 17th and 18th centuries. And teaching some of the Spanish colonial architecture and earlier architecture in the state has been fantastically rewarding. It's been great. I think the biggest revelation for me has been the churches in the pueblos built in the 17th and 18th century by the Spanish with labour, with Native American labour. Actually, yesterday I was in Taos looking at the church in Manchester, Taos, which is an incredible building, a building that is completely unique to this part of the world. They have sort of approximate plans based on European architecture of the period, but the materials make them so completely different. The forms of the building are extraordinary, the surface texture of the adobe, the carving. As I said, they've been a revelation to me, and I think they're buildings, as I said, of international significance. I've loved going to them. So my book, which was published last October by Oxford University Press, the title is Architects and Intellectual Culture in Post-Restoration England. And it was research. There's some parts of my doctoral research in it, but predominantly it was research done when I had an Andrew Mellon Fellowship at Oxford. And it explores a moment in English architectural history when architecture is really treated for the first time as a major intellectual subject. Books are written on it, long books, texts that spend a long time analysing architecture, in particular the legacy of the ancient world. And that moment happens at the end of the 17th century. It's also the moment when the English start building classical architecture to a very large degree. Prior to that, there was much less classical architecture in Britain. And so the book explores that moment, in particular through those texts. So the first chapter focuses on what those texts have to say about the status of the architect. This is the period where the English begin to argue that the architect is an intellectual figure who, to become an architect, you need to read certain books as opposed to spend time on a building site. This is the period where the apprenticeship system of the Middle Ages is being rejected. As somebody who is seen as illiterate and vulgar by the artists I work on, as opposed to the intellectual architect. The book then goes on to explore those sources, those books that architects needed to read in order to become architects, according to these writers. I then look at English writers exploring the legacy of the ancient world. And finally, I turn to probably the hardest question in architectural history, how architects conceived of designing buildings, the design process in architecture, which again is constructed in this period in a very intellectual way. You have to read the following books, do the following things, know the following pieces of knowledge in order to be an appropriate designer of buildings. So that's what the book is essentially about. I love my job and I love teaching architectural history, and in particular I like teaching it to architecture students. One of the things that I get very enthusiastic about historical buildings and don't sort of apologise for that. I find the historical built environment the most interesting thing to study and think about, and the most interesting places to go to. And so I hope that I've sort of communicated that to the students. Whilst they're busy in studio working on design projects, there's also this incredible, interesting resource on their doorstep. These amazing historic buildings in the States and in the United States in general, that they should pay attention to, that is just as important as their studio work. And I hope to have done that to some degree, mainly sort of through getting too excited in lectures about buildings, but also, you know, trying to encourage them to think about and visit historic architecture. Green chili, without a doubt. I love the food around here. And again, that was a sort of big revelation. I thought the thing that I would like most about New Mexico would be the weather, the weather is great compared to where I'm from, but the food's even better. Yeah, I love the food. I love the chili. The chili tastes different here to anywhere else. It's got so much more flavour in it. I'm going to have to take loads of cans back with me because I'm going to miss it. I'm not sure I can be able to cope without it.